Coming up, the Nets finally trade Cam Johnson, and it's a blockbuster move. I'll break down all aspects of the deal after this.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. Thank you for making me your first listen of the day. This show is 100% free on all those great platforms. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. And on today's show, it's another emergency podcast, my second of the week, but this one, a little bit more magnitude to it because the Brooklyn Nets just traded Cam Johnson to the Denver Nuggets for Michael Porter Jr. and an unprotected 2032 first-round pick. So obviously a blockbuster trade there on the first day of free agency for the Nets. And they get rid of Cam Johnson, their top player from this past season, a guy who came over in that Kevin Durant trade from the Phoenix Suns and was sort of the last remnants of that deal and that kind of transitional period after the Nets moved off KD and Kyrie and we're in that limbo phase. Now they're going into the rebuild, and this is really a signifier that this is a full rebuild. I think we knew that with them making 5 first-round picks in this draft, but getting off CJ, they're all in on this, and they're really going, for the rebuild, at least for this past season and likely beyond. But initial reactions to the deal, I think it's a good deal for the Nets. I think it's a win for both sides. I think it's a good deal for Brooklyn. I think it's a good deal for Denver. Obviously, Denver looking to, bolster their wing rotation, get a little bit of a guy who's a little bit more of a veteran presence and a playoff upgrade over Michael Porter Jr. So they get that in Cam Johnson. They get off Porter Jr.'s salary, and they pay a 2032 first-round pick. And from the Nets' perspective, CJ's obviously a guy who has been a rumored trade guy for the last year, ever since they moved off Mikal Bridges, his twin, and sent him to the New York Knicks, got those first-round picks back from the Houston Rockets, and entered this rebuild. He's a guy for the last year. A lot of people thought he was going to be traded last offseason. A lot of people thought he was going to be traded at the deadline, and the Nets held on to him. And, I reported extensively on the trade, rumblings surrounding CJ at the deadline. And everything I had heard was that the Nets had a really steep asking price. They weren't making calls. They were taking calls, and they weren't even really taking calls too seriously because the asking price was reportedly 2 first-round picks. That's apparently what they wanted for CJ, but they were content to keep him. And now, they do 2 things in this deal. We've obviously know that salary dumps are a route they've been going using their cap space. So in this deal, it is a salary dump taking on Michael Porter Jr.'s contract, but it's also, they're getting a 2032 unprotected first-round pick for CJ. And I said, they were asking apparently for 2 first-round picks at the trade deadline. You might say, they got off of that. They didn't get 2 first-round picks to the deadline, and now they have to settle for 1 first-round pick. But this first-round pick is an unprotected 2032 pick from a Nuggets team where you have no idea what they're going to be in that year. So an unprotected pick that far out is the equivalent, if not more, than a lot of 2 first-round pick packages that you're going to get from other teams where they might be heavily protected. They might be from teams who are going to be really good. They might be, in the near future from teams who are going to be playoff contenders. In Denver's case, in 2032, Nikola Jokic is going to be 36 years old. Have no idea if he's going to be playing at, an elite level at that stage. We don't even know if he's going to be playing in the NBA at that point. There's obviously a lot of rumblings, people question Jokic is a different kind of cat, and people don't even know how long he's going to want to play in the NBA. So we're talking about, 7 years from now, there's a very good chance maybe Nikola Jokic isn't playing in the NBA anymore, or he isn't playing for the Nuggets. And at that point, who are the Nuggets? You have no idea, but they were willing to, pay that unprotected 2032 first-round pick in order to, try to maximize the window now around Nikola Jokic, and the Nets having the cap space to take on Michael Porter Jr. in this trade. And, having an appetite, obviously, to get an asset like that 2032 first-round pick, they take it. And I think it's a good deal for the Nets. Is it, an outstanding home run deal? No, like they didn't get multiple first-round picks for CJ, but I think this is about as good of a pick and an asset as you're going to get in this trade. So that's good business, I think, by the Nets. I think it's also good business by the Nuggets. And when you look at Michael Porter Jr., and what the salary situation with him and CJ both have 2 years left on their contract. But MPJ has significantly more money on his deal. He is under contract for $38 million next season and then $41 million in 2026-27. CJ's at $21 million this season and $23 million. So the Nets add, a significant amount of a chunk of money to their books this season and next. But with the amount of cap space they have, with the amount of financial flexibility they have, this is what affords them, the ability to do that. This is why we talked about, CJ, I said, obviously being speculated as a trade guy for how, over the last year. Also last season with the Nets trading Dennis Schroeder and Dorian Finney-Smith a little bit later than people expected. Why did Sean Marks trade them later and hold on to them? Because he was prioritizing getting back expiring contracts in those deals. He did that in the Dennis Schroeder trade, brought back DeAnthony Melton expiring. In the DFS trade, brought back D'Angelo Russell's expiring. And that, allowed them to get this cap space and maintain that cap flexibility this season and into the future, this offseason and into the future. And with that, that allowed them to make the deal with the Atlanta Hawks, where they got Terrence Mann in the number 22 pick, which they used on Drake Powell. And also it allows them to have additional, even more cap space to take on a guy like MPJ and get a 2032 unprotected first round pick, which is a really good asset. And the Nets are just loaded from a draft perspective right now. This is really them. They lead the NBA in first round picks over the next 7 years, tradable first round picks, all that. But they have picks in the short term, the medium term, in the long term, some of which are protected, some of which are unprotected. So they're really diversifying their pick stash. And this is a pick that, people are going to say, some fans might say, this is forever from now, 2032. What are we going to draft in 2032? This is a third grader or whatever. But that's a valuable pick down the line. It's also that value that it has could be impactful in trade negotiations if the Nets are to try to package this and expedite their timeline anytime between now and between 2032. And that pick, the closer you get, it could grow in value. You don't know what's going to happen. So it's a good asset. I think it's as good of an asset as the Nets are going to get in a trade for Cam Johnson. And then they also get Michael Porter Jr. And there's obviously a question of what he's going to be with the Nets in the short term, what his contract could mean for them. So I'll get into all that, break down every aspect of Michael Porter Jr. after a quick break. The MLB season is heating up, and every game brings clutch hits, standout pitching, and unforgettable moments. From walk-off homers to no-hitters in the making, there's no shortage of drama on the diamond and no better time to get in on the action. FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live with player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays. Fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. Look, guys, maybe you're watching the Yankees. Aaron Judge and the Bronx Bombers are just on a tear offensively. You could combine prop bets from multiple hitters. If you get a read on who's heating up, why not back it up with a same-game parlay? New to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Coming back from the break on today's Locked On Nets episode, this emergency podcast after the Nets traded Cam Johnson to the Denver Nuggets for Michael Porter Jr. and an unprotected 2032 first-round pick. I outlined why I thought this was a good deal for the Nets, focusing on that 2032 unprotected first-round pick and the quality of the asset that is, the best asset I think that they were going to get back in a Cam Johnson trade. Now talking about Michael Porter Jr., I outlined on the previous segment, it's under contract for the next 2 seasons at about $79 million total, 38 this year, 41 next season. And when you look at Michael Porter Jr., the kind of player he is, he's obviously a good player, from a skill set standpoint, from a talent standpoint. I think people would say he's just as good, if not better, to Cam Johnson, from that perspective. But some of the intangibles, some of the, fitting into the role, knowing what you want to do, some of the IQ stuff, the veteran stuff that I said Denver was probably looking for. Clearly, Cam Johnson is ahead of him in some of those regards. And that's why Denver was willing to, pay that pick to get Cam Johnson and to get off Michael Porter Jr.'s contract to send him to the Nets. But MPJ is not a bad player by any stretch of the imagination. He's a guy with great size, near 6'10", obviously 40% three-point shooter on high volume for his career, has some on-the-ball juice and some of that stuff. And he's a player who, with this contract, 2 years, $79 million left on this deal, as I said, is he a guy that I think is going to play himself into being a positive value asset for the Nets over the next 2 years? I don't think so. but he is a guy who I think, might not have extreme negative value if he's able to round out, if he's able to improve on some of the things that he was struggling with the Nuggets, and maybe even flash some other things that he wasn't able to do while playing there with Denver and being in more of a complementary role. So, is it a positive asset contract? Obviously not, based on what Denver just did with him. Do I think he can play it into being, not so much of a negative contract? Yes. And you also can't discount the fact that MPJ could be a guy that the Nets are, going to build into the future with. And maybe they see him as a guy who they like. Obviously, Jordi Fernandez coached him when he was with Denver. He's familiar with him from a skill set and from a personality standpoint. So that can't be discounted. Ramona Shelburne reported right after news of this deal broke that the Nets are intent on keeping Michael Porter Jr. They are said to like him. So you can take that however you will. You're obviously going to say that about a lot of guys when you're bringing them in a trade and they're going to be in your building in a day or two. But he's a guy who you can't, because of the age, he's 27 years old. Cam Johnson, 29 years old, with him being 2 years younger. And you could argue having some more upside than Cam Johnson from a skill set perspective, and also just being younger and fitting the timeline a little bit better. He's a guy that they could build into the future with. Now, if that isn't the case, he's also a guy where you don't necessarily have to worry too much about the value of his contract and whether it's going to be such a negative asset, because it's going to be expiring next season. So in essence, this contract can be, a $41 million trade exception next season, where the Nets can use that in a variety of ways. We all know the Nets have had some appetite to go big game hunting and to, go after a star in the near future. If they tank this season, they get whatever pick they get in the draft, and they're looking to push the timeline forward the season after this coming season, you have MPJ under contract for $41 million. And that's a contract where the team that's getting him, it's an expiring. They could clear their books using it. It resets their books. They could look to re-sign him and bring him back on a better value deal or whatever along those lines. But it's a deal that you don't necessarily have to worry so much about the value of it and whether it's negative or positive, because when it's an expiring deal, it might be a little bit easier to move off of that as opposed to it having multiple years left on it. So those are some of the ways you can look at Michael Porter Jr. as a guy maybe the Nets could potentially move forward with, but also a contract that, with it being an expiring after this coming season, it really could be, somewhat of an asset for them in that regard. And when you look at, the Nets this coming season, they're able to take on this contract, and the big number that it is, and not really worry about it, because there's obviously going to be tanking. They're going to be in a rebuild this coming year. And how does MPJ fit into that? Some fans might have some concerns about, him hurting the tank, and if we're going to move off CJ, maybe they'd want to get, a player who's worse and has less capabilities than him. But I would say that I don't think, Michael Porter Jr., while I think he has, a better skill set, or he's more talented than Cam Johnson in a lot of regards, I don't think he's a guy who's necessarily going to hurt the tank much more than Cam Johnson. And I do think that he offers, spacing and some of the things, and, some of the aspects that you would want around the young ball handlers that the Nets just brought in. So he's a guy who I think is going to play with the Nets this season. Obviously, he's going to be a starter. He's going to have a really heavy offensive role, but is he a guy that's necessarily going to carry them to a ton more wins than, you would have thought before? It's not impossible, but I don't think, it's necessarily the most likely outcome. Also, I think the Nets are willing to take that chance and just figure it out later, because they got a 2032, unprotected first-round pick from the Nuggets in this deal. So MPJ, a guy the Nets could build forward with, and they could look to keep him. They could be high on him based on that Jordi Fernandez connection. He could also be a guy whose contract being an expiring in 2026, 27 affords them some flexibility in, how they're potentially maybe going to go after stars, or how they look to build this out with trades moving forward. So Sean Marks gets another salary dump in this deal. Obviously, it's something that he's been extremely adept in doing throughout his time managing this team. When he came in 2016 and rebuilt the team the first time around, he executed those salary dumps with, getting a first-round pick alongside DeMarre Carroll, getting D'Angelo Russell from the Lakers in return for Brook Lopez, with Timofey Mozgov's contract coming alongside D'Lo. Also executed some other of those moves. And now when you look at what the Nets have done from a salary dump perspective this year, they get Terrence Mann and Michael Porter Jr., they send out Cam Johnson, and they get 2 first-round picks, one of which turned into Drake Powell, and one of which is very valuable, or could be very valuable, as an unprotected 2032 pick from a Nuggets team who you have no idea what they're going to be that far out. So going to take one more quick break. And when I come back, I'm going to talk about what could potentially be next for the Nets after this blockbuster trade involving Cam Johnson. Coming back from the break, closing out today's Locked On Nets episode, this emergency podcast edition, talking about Cam Johnson and the trade sending him to the Denver Nuggets for Michael Porter Jr. and an unprotected 2032 first-round pick. And the Nets finally did it with Cam Johnson. I'm not completely surprised. I always thought there was a possibility that the Nets were going to trade Cam Johnson. But when Sean Marks spoke at the exit interview, I asked him about the possibility of trading Cam Johnson, and he said that the Nets were extremely high on him from a leadership standpoint, obviously from what he brought to the court from an on-court standpoint. And also, he said they were in no rush to move off of guys like that. So obviously, anything an executive says, you have to take it with a grain of salt. And there's always a possibility that guys can still get moved when executives say stuff like that. But I do believe that. And I do know that the Nets were extremely high on Cam Johnson, especially from a leadership perspective and what he brought to that locker room. Sean told me, he wanted Cam to step into more of a leadership role. And now I think the unprotected 2032 first-round pick was enough for the Nets to move off of that. And, it's not surprising to me, but there is a little bit of that veteran leadership, void here now when you trade away a guy like Cam Johnson. I spoke about it on a prior podcast, and the reasons why the Nets potentially wouldn't trade him is the leadership. They brought in 5 first-round picks. They're going to have 5 rookies coming in with Yegor Demon, Drake Powell, Nolan Traore, Ben Saraf, and Danny Wolf. No team has ever had a first-round class coming in like that in the history of the NBA. So you're going to want some veteran leadership, on the team when that's the case. And I thought that could potentially be a reason, obviously, that the Nets would not look to move off of Cam Johnson based off of Sean Marks' comments. But they get that 2032 first-round pick, and this is a deal where if you got this offer, I don't think the Nets could turn it down. And now you look at the vets. Who are the guys on this team who are really those veteran presence? You have Nick Claxton, only 26 years old, though I wouldn't necessarily consider him like a seasoned veteran. You have Terrence Mann, a similar age, 28. You have Michael Porter Jr., 27. All these guys have been in the league for a while, but I wouldn't consider them seasoned veterans. So could the Nets look to bring in another guy, via free agency? Could there be another guy coming in and another salary dump? It's certainly a possibility. You look at their cap situation after this deal, they still have over $17 million in cap space left. So they have more flexibility to, sign, whether it be a veteran guy on the free agent market, whether they bring in a buyout guy. There is more flexibility for added moves there. So you could see another move from the Nets here. I don't think they're done. They have to spend more cap space to get to that salary floor. So there's going to be more moves here. But, from the veteran leadership standpoint, it is lacking a little bit. Like you don't have that one seasoned vet, that one guy who is the Cam Johnson or whoever. And, I think some fans will say that doesn't matter. We're tanking next season, all this, but there is a value in that. When you talk about guys, who've come up in the league and, young rookies who have come up and become successful players down the line, a lot of the time they talk about the guys, in their first few seasons who were their vets. If you talk about these guys who are coming in next season, particularly a guy like Yegor Demon, some of the first lottery pick the Nets have made since 2010, who's going to be his vet? Is it Nick Claxton? Is it Terrence Mann? Is it Michael Porter Jr.? It could be, but those guys aren't exactly seasoned veterans. So there's definitely something to look out for there with potentially more moves. And staying on the topic of potential moves in the fallout from this, what could come next? Obviously, I just said $17 million in cap space. They have to spend cap space. So another salary dumping option, a veteran in the free agent market. Maybe they take a swing on a younger guy. That's also an option. Nick Claxton, another guy who's a veteran, could have some trade value. Could a team like the Los Angeles Lakers potentially be interested in him? That's something to look out for. I said the Phoenix Suns were a team that had been linked to him, but they got Kaman Maluach in the draft. So the Lakers still need a center. DeAndre Ayton just got bought out. Maybe he could be a target for them, but also with the Nets moving off of Cam Johnson, they're really into a rebuild situation there. And, could there be a Nick Claxton deal on the horizon? It's definitely a possibility. The Nets just re-signed Day'Ron Sharpe to a two-year, $12 million contract. So they have Day'Ron locked down for the next 2 seasons at a minimum. And that could make Claxton expendable, especially if the right offer comes along. So if the Lakers come along and they're offering, that 2031 first-round pick, maybe a 2030 swap and salary fillers, could that be something the Nets consider? I definitely think it would be. Is it the best deal to make? I've outlined that on prior pods. It might not be, but it depends on, a variety of factors and how you're viewing Claxton and the Nets situation. But just closing this out, talking about the Nets situation and where they find themselves now for next season. They have these 5 rookies coming in, Yegor Demon and Nolan Traore, obviously going to be guys who have the ball in their hands a lot. There's not been a deal yet with Cam Thomas, but I would suspect that they're going to agree to something with him soon. So you're looking at, if you're looking at the core of what the team is right now, you have Cam Thomas, you have Michael Porter Jr., you have Nick Claxton, you have Day'Ron Sharpe, you have Terrence Mann who came in, you have all these rookies, obviously, but it's not a team that I would expect to be very good. But if you look at where they are from an asset standpoint, they're loaded, and then they're also going to have the ability to tank next season and try to pick up another draft pick in a loaded 2026 draft that features 3 studs at the top of the draft in AJ DeBansta, Darren Peterson, and Cam Boozer. So this shakes up what the Nets are going to look like next year, but I think it is a signal, obviously, that they're going towards the full rebuild. They're committing to this at least for next season and probably beyond that. So for a lot of Nets fans, that might be frustrating. For a lot of Nets fans, I think a lot more Nets fans would say it's exciting because of the opportunity and the Nets really committing to a full rebuild and a build through the draft model. They really haven't, in however long, and Cam Johnson being kind of the last remnants of that holdover period after Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving departed. He's out the door now, and the Nets are heading in a new direction, and there's going to be a lot to break down. This has been a crazy week for the Nets, and there's only going to be more moves moving forward, I think, with the Cam Thomas extension still needs to come in. There's still obviously salary dumps and other free agent moves that could come in. So I'll have coverage of all that and more here on Locked On Nets, but that does it for this emergency podcast, today's episode. Thank you for tuning in and supporting the show. Be sure to subscribe to Locked On Nets on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Be sure to like this, comment. Let me know what you think of the trade. Like it if you enjoyed the content. Anything you could do to engage is much appreciated. But I'll be back tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.